Today I wanted to do a video talking about two different Mason and Hamlin pianos. First of all, because Mason and Hamlin pianos are really pretty cool, and also because these pianos are made in different times and they have some interesting differences that I wanted to show you. Just the small little details about pianos that make them rather interesting, at least to me. So first I wanted to start off with the older Mason and Hamlin and also the larger Mason and Hamlin. This is a Mason and Hamlin Double B, their 7-foot model from roughly the 1970s. And the first thing I wanted to touch on is the harp. Now, Mason and Hamlin has a unique harp design that I'll show you in a little bit, and it's called the full perimeter plate, and it basically runs around the entire rim of the pianos, where no other manufacturer does that, and we'll touch on that in a bit later. But I first just wanted to show you the general aesthetic of this older style harp. Now, this was made using sand casting techniques, and it results in a rougher, more uneven surface, and it makes the piano look a bit older than it is. Like I said, this is made in the 1970s, but if you look at it, you could kind of imagine that it's a piano from the 1920s that's been kept in real good condition. So it's just a kind of an interesting thing about Mason and Hamlin's from this era. They look a little bit older than they really are, but this piano is from 1970. The sand cast plates are very thick, and they're very heavy and very durable, and they do the job very, very well. And now let's take a look at the full perimeter plate. As you can see here, the plate runs all the way around the rim, as most pianos do, and then when we get down here, it continues all the way out to the rim of the piano, which is the wooden part here, and it goes all the way down along back up to the damper area of the keyboard. And most pianos do not have harp here. They might have some bracing like this, but generally there is no harp with portholes and thick metal right here in that area, and it's a unique Mason and Hamlin trait. It's called the full perimeter plate, and they've been doing it for many, many years, basically ever since the company was founded, but not really. But they've been doing it for a long time, and it's a feature of Mason and Hamlin that really helps the pianos last throughout the years. Before we continue with the piano and talking about its details, I wanted to make one correction on what I said earlier. It's actually from 1980 and not 1970, but Masons from this time period are very similar. If you looked at one from 1970 and one from 1980, they'd probably be about the same, but I just wanted to make that correction because it's important. So another thing about this era of Mason and Hamlin that's different from a new Mason and Hamlin is the style of music desk. Now this would basically be about the same. A music desk is a music desk, but if we look at just the aesthetic here, it rounds out like this, and they've been doing this on their pianos since the 1900s, this rounded style of music desk. When you pull it forward, it kind of sticks out like that. And I assume this probably comes back from the days when people probably used to have candle holders here, and I've even seen a piano that had special candle holders, not a Mason, a different brand, but candle holders that were round like that, and they swung out in front of the music so that you could put candles and you'd be able to see, which is pretty dangerous, but they were round and they swung out. And maybe that's where this rounded shape comes from, is the candle holder. And I just wanted to point that out because it's an interesting detail about Masons, and if you see one that has this rounded shape, it's an older model and it's not a brand new model that just rolled off the showroom floor. I mentioned the older style logo that was found on the Fallbird earlier, and this here is it. As you can see, once again, it's that really old-timey font. When I see it, I think of like the New York Times or some kind of that old style font that was really popular back in the day. And we still, when you look at it today, you think of that era, the early 1900s. And Mason and Hamlin was still using this font even up into the 2000s, as you'll see in a minute. But if you looked at a brand new Mason and Hamlin, or even one from a few years ago, you'd see that it had a much more modern style, all caps, block letter font that looks a lot more modern and does not invoke the idea of the early 1900s. As you can see here, this is the newer Mason from 2001, and as you can see here, the little extra pieces on the side of the music desk are more flat and they're straight. Now this is actually the Monticello version, and so that's why the music desk has the little carvings that you can actually stick your entire hand through. But on a new Mason and Hamlin, the sides of the music desk would be straight, similar to this, much like you would find on many other types of pianos made today. I just said that this is the Monticello version of the Mason and Hamlin, and as you can see, these legs here, as well as the posts for the lyre, are a bit of a blast from the past. I think I've heard people call these ice cream cone legs. I could be wrong about that, but you can kind of see where they would if it looks like a giant ice cream cone and the ice cream goes up here. And they got really cool little grooves in them, and it's made of this beautiful rosewood as well, which is really cool. The side of the piano in particular looks really beautiful. The posts for the lyre here have that same curved aesthetic, and they're round with the little fluting down the sides, as well as the leg on the left and the leg in the back as well. So I just thought you might find that interesting that the legs on this piano are a little bit different than the usual straight, just the usual straight legs. Now let's take a look at the harp on the new 2001 Mason and Hamlin. As you can see, it is a much shinier look, it's much smoother, it's much more modern look compared to the rougher, older look of the 1980 Mason. Now, what I've been told is that the older harps, like the one we just looked at on the 1980s piano, were actually made in the USA, but these new harps are actually made in China and then imported to the United States, where the rest of the piano is assembled in Haverhill, Massachusetts. So that's kind of an interesting detail. As you can see here, the Mason and Hamlin logo on the harp is slightly different. The Mason and Hamlin font is still curved there, but underneath it says Boston, which it didn't before, and it's pretty cool looking. It's also outlined in black. The other one, it is, but it's a bit faded by now. And also, this smaller model also has the full perimeter plate. As you can see, we follow the plate around, and then once we get down here to the spine of the piano, it continues on right down the spine of the piano. Now, I was told by someone, and I forget if it was on my YouTube comments or someone I met at a dealer somewhere, that the smaller Masons didn't use the full perimeter plate, but as we can see here, this is an A, and it has the full perimeter plate, so maybe it was older Masons that didn't use the full perimeter plate on the smaller models, and then in more recent years, they've added it to the smaller lineup of pianos as well. I'm not sure, but as you can see, this A has the full perimeter plate as well. You can also see this beautiful rosewood that they used on the piano all around, not only on the inside, but on the outside as well, which I'm sure you've been able to notice, and it's just absolutely beautiful. Another interesting thing about this piano, and also newer Mason and Hamlins, is that the sides and the front of the keys, of the black keys, are made with, I believe, it's rosewood, and that would make sense since the rest of this piano is rosewood, and then the top of the piano of the black key is ebony. And I noticed that even when I went to the Mason and Hamlin factory just a few years ago, around in 2014, they had some models that were not the special the Monticello version. They were just a regular black Mason and Hamlin, but they had the rosewood accented sharp keys, which I thought was kind of interesting. It's a neat idea. This particular example, the wood on the side is very light and it's very unusual, but sometimes you get particularly dark wood on the side, and it's a really subtle detail that's very nice to look at. As I mentioned, this piano also has the older style logo. For some reason it's faded in an odd way, but you can see here that it is the older style font of the Mason and Hamlin logo. Like I said, the new Masons have a much more modern looking block style font. It's very difficult to see, but you can kind of see it right there above my hand. There it is. Now let's do a sound test on the 1980 Mason and Hamlin. I'm going to play a short little melody that I wrote to test out the treble and the tenor of pianos, and hopefully it will do a good job of demonstrating both the 1980 Mason and Hamlin as well as the new 2001 model. As you can hear, despite being from 1980 and being roughly about 30 or so years old, this piano is actually pretty nice. It has a very nice sound, and the action is also much lighter than some pianos I've seen from this time period by Mason and Hamlin. Sometimes you get a piano from this era by Mason, and the action is just really clunky and they're hard to play, but this action is actually much lighter than that, and it responds very well both to slow music as well as fast, loud music, which I was playing earlier, and it responds well to both, and it's a pretty nice piano. As you can see, the hammers in here are original, and the strings and the tuning pins, everything here is original, and so it's pretty cool that it sounds as good as it does, and it goes to show how well Mason and Hamlin's will last. Now let's play that same little song on the newer model 2001 Mason and Hamlin piano. also sounds very, very nice. It has a brighter sound to it, which I almost didn't expect. I thought that the 1980s piano would have been brighter since it had the original hammers, and they have been played quite a bit at some point because there are some wear grooves in the hammers. But this one, even though the hammers don't have much wear in them at all, is still, at least it sounds to me, the recorder might be picking it up differently, but this one actually sounds brighter, and that's probably because Mason has lacquered the hammers, or someone has, at some point in this piano's past. Now, oftentimes, hammers get lacquered because there's a lack of sustain and they try to make the treble more powerful, but this piano has good sustain. It's about dead by now. The note was slightly out of tune, but you could hear that the note and the sound trailed off very evenly, and it lasted for quite some time. So perhaps Mason was just using harder hammers at this time, or they were lacquered or something like that. I'm not 100% sure, but the piano does have a nice sound overall, and a bright sound can be helpful with certain songs, or also if you're playing with other instruments, like in a band or an orchestral situation where you want it to be able to cut through the other instruments and come out on top. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video of a comparison between two Mason and Hamlin. It's kind of interesting to see the little design details between 1980 and 2001. It's kind of cool. I like the little details that go into the making of pianos. It's kind of fun for me to look at, and hopefully you've enjoyed it as well. You can go check out my channel. I've got lots of more piano reviews. I've got videos on Masons and all kinds of other manufacturers as well. So you can go check that out, look at my content, and if you like it, you might want to think about subscribing, and if you do, thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.